Welcome to Art Ed Radio, the podcast for art teachers. This show is produced by the Art of Education University, and I'm your host, Tim Bogans. Today, we are going to talk about communication and collaboration. Now, the impetus for this topic, I just want to explain a little to you. A couple weeks ago, we talked about the AOEU retreat, all of the great professional learning that was going on, a lot of things that we did. And one of those things was Amber Kane did a collaborative project with this extensive, really colorful weaving project, but it also had these amazing exercises and lessons in communication, which made for a wonderful learning experience. And when she posted pictures and when the AOEU account posted pictures, just got this huge response on social media. So we started thinking that it may be a good podcast topic. So I invited Amber. Or actually, if we're being honest, she invited herself, but she's a good friend, so we'll let that slide. And hopefully some of those lessons, some of those ideas, and some of those exercises that we talk about and converse about today can help you in both your career and in your classroom. So let me bring on Amber right now. All right, and joining me now is Miss Amber Kane. Amber, how are you?
I am doing wonderful. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm very excited that you are on the show. I'm very excited to talk to you. And I know you put together this awesome presentation at our team retreat, which I talked about a couple weeks ago on the podcast. I know you've gotten a ton of attention for it on social media and kind of the awesome weaving you put together. But I don't want to talk about that just yet because we need to learn our lessons first, right? So before we actually got to do all of this awesome weaving at the retreat, you talked a lot about communication and kind of learning how we best communicate. So let me just start with this question for you. Why do you think it's important for us, especially as teachers, to kind of reflect on how we communicate and the best ways that we communicate?
Yeah, so I think for a lot of us, especially teachers, communication is something that tends to come rather naturally. So we tend to like standing in front of a room and talking. Even written form of communication tends to be something that we do a lot. And whenever we do something a lot, we can also really easily fall into bad habits. And if we don't take the time to reflect on what we're doing, what's working really well, what's not working at all, we really don't have room to improve. And so as teachers, since we're communicating so much and we're communicating to our students, to our coworkers, to administrators and parents, and all of those people need to be communicated with in slightly different ways and even using some different language. Every once in a while, we sit back and kind of reflect and come up with a plan and then implement that so that we just continue to get better as we move forward. The other part of that is I've also realized it's really easy to assume that everyone else really loves to communicate in the same method that you do. So, for example, I hate talking on the phone. I lose my phone on a very regular basis, and it's normally on silent. So it's hard to find. And so what I realized is that that's somewhat problematic because some of my coworkers talking on the phone is their favorite thing to do. And they can't ever get a hold of me because I'm I don't know where my phone is located. And so I shouldn't always be forcing them into my preferred method, which if it's not face-to-face, then I really prefer a video chat. But I'm kind of realizing, well, that's not always fair to push people into well, this is how I like it best. And kind of sometimes having to go back and forth.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I want to actually dive into that in a little bit. But first, I want to ask you a little bit more if you can, I guess, expand on the idea of reflecting on how we communicate, because that's something, I'm always doing on the podcast, is encouraging people to reflect, usually on their teaching, but I think, it's valuable for communication as well. So, in looking at that, like what kinds of questions, if people want to reflect, what should they be asking themselves? Like, how can we, or I guess, how should we think about how we're communicating, and how do we go about reflecting on that?
Yeah. So I'm going to pull out maybe the questions that I feel like, especially when we did this at the retreat, that people seem to choose the most often and were talked about the most, because that was kind of a signal to me that those seem to be the most important and that people were really resonating with them.
Mm-hmm.
So one is to really think about, which I kind of alluded to in my last answer, is how do you prefer to be communicated to? And again, like I wasn't consciously realizing, well, I wish you would just do a video chat with me, until I really sat down and started answering these questions of like, oh, I like to have video conversations because I like to see people's body language. And once you start to understand that, you can also tell people your preferred method of communication. I think another really good one is looking at how do you best communicate? So what is that platform for you? Are you best when you're standing in front of a whole room of students? Are you best working in small groups or working with one-on-one, or is your written communication really like the strongest thing for you? When you realize what you're best at, you can think about how can you do more of that, but it will also help you realize, well, maybe that's not the thing I need to practice as much. I need to practice this other area that I'm not quite as strong in. And then this is kind of a combination of a question to reflect on and a little bit of an exercise. So thinking about who are 2 to 3 people, and I think you could do this a couple different ways. So you could think of break it into groups, even as teachers. So you could think of coworkers, your students, and parents. And think of groups of people that you communicate with really well, where it just comes naturally, and it sort of always has come naturally. And try and think about, what are things that have actually made that work? And are there ways that you can actually implement that into relationships that aren't going as smoothly? And then also doing the reverse of, who are 2 to 3 people that just communication never really seems to go smoothly. Like every time you try, you're like, I thought we were going to get it this time, and that was awkward again. And really then start to think about, what can you change? And then just start to try that of like, if every time you send the person an email, the communication is misunderstood and it turns into a mess, then maybe stop emailing and try to actually talk to the person in person or pick up the phone, so that you're a little bit more intentional and don't just keep repeating the same disasters that you've had before.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But I also want to ask you though, because you said to, I guess, share preferences with people around you on, how you like to be communicated with. Like, what would you recommend for people with that? Because doesn't that seem like an awkward conversation to like go to your principal or go to your administrator and say, hey, when you've talked to me, I'd like to be it in this format. Like that's going to be a super awkward conversation. So, I mean, what would be your advice for like, how do you share that with people? How do you, use that preferred method of communication and hopefully get other people to do it as well?
Right. Yes. Because I guess we are trying to avoid those awkward conversations. So some is reflecting on first the group or the individual that you're talking to. So for me, with my students, I'm actually very upfront and just tell them how I like to be communicated with. So while I did teach in the classroom for a while, I teach online now. And so I repeatedly, because we all know we have to repeat ourselves, tell my students that my preferred method of communication is for them to ask questions within our Google Classroom. So that's easier for me to stay organized, as well as it just lets all of the students see the question at once, and hopefully makes it so I don't have to answer the question so many times. And that they only email me if it's something really personal or private. And as we all know, like, yes, that sounds great that I say that to them. And then you have to really kind of continue to do that in practice. So if a student emails me a question that is like, when's the assignment due? That's a question that should be in our Google Classroom. I will email them back and say, you need to post this in Google Classroom to get an answer. And I know that can seem kind of like tiresome in the beginning. And sometimes I do just want to answer the question and like move on with my life. But that means they're just going to keep on emailing. And so some of it is kind of that training. And so I think we can apply that same type of idea with our administrator. So yes, depending on your relationship with your administrator, it would be weird to walk into their office and be like, look, I really hate face-to-face meetings. So from now on, I'm going to need you to write me a handwritten letter, because that's what I prefer. So some is kind of helping to signal to them how you prefer to be communicated with, so that maybe when they give you options for how you're setting up a meeting, seeing if you can get it in writing, or so information for me in writing is actually one of my preferred methods, especially when there's something I have to do. So when I had to have an in-person meeting with my administrator, I would actually go back to my room and kind of like rewrite the action steps. Like, this is what we discussed has to happen, and send it in an email. And he was just kind of used to that. Like, I don't need you to sort of like, this is what Amber's doing today. But like, so it was kind of meeting in the middle of like, this is where I need the communication to be. But I do know that it can't always be me. So thinking about how you can kind of, how you can balance that out. And especially when you're the one initiating the conversation, how do you initiate that conversation in your preferred method? And you might even say like, I'd appreciate you to write back with your response. Or if you send an email, but your preferred mode of communication is in person, you might say, and I'd like to set up 10 minutes to meet with you in your office, or I'd like to set up a 15-minute phone call. So kind of trying to signal that. And then also thinking about when you're having your evaluations with your administrators, how can you kind of incorporate that? If it's not going well, how can you incorporate that into your evaluation?
Okay, that's all a lot of really good advice. So thank you for kind of sharing all that and giving some direction to that conversation. Now, I said earlier, I want to talk about the weaving project as well, because that was awesome. And, you tied together both the communication aspect along with this collaborative project. It was beautiful. Visually, it was incredible. And I know you got a ton of love on social media with it. So I guess basically, can you just kind of describe the project, how you tied everything together, and what you did with our AOEU team?
Yeah, sure. So there were kind of two goals with the project. The project was supposed to encourage communication and also art making. So there were a couple different components to it. And so the first was what we've kind of already talked about, was me sharing some ideas about communication. And then on the table, there were prompts of asking all different kinds of questions about communication. And so people could move around the room and they were picking up paper strips and they needed to respond to at least 3 of those questions. And the goal of this was really to be more of a private, personal experience, but to have everybody take some time to really reflect on different aspects of communication. And then the next kind of level of it was I gave very minimal instruction as to how the weaving should be done, and just kind of stood back and watched. The only things that I encouraged were, because we had larger groups, we had about 12 people in a group, was that people kind of potentially broke into smaller groups, and you could do smaller sections of weaving that then could be woven together, because it was important to me that there weren't some people just like standing around with nothing to do, which most teachers are normally concerned about.
Yes.
And also gave some instruction on, there were glue sticks, that it can be helpful, but it wasn't a requirement, that it could be helpful to just start to glue some ends down as they go to make the structure of the weaving a little bit stronger. And then I just kind of watched, and it was pretty fascinating, because we also had 3 groups rotating through. So like the first group, they kind of started and could do whatever they wanted. And then the second group had to deal with what the first group left them. And then I think probably my favorite part was the second group they wrote a note to the third group, because I had shared, if you're welcome to attempt to communicate to the group coming after you. So they wrote them a note, and they asked if the piece could be wearable, because it had started to look like this kind of crazy headpiece. So the third group came, and I shared that note with them, and they adamantly were like, no, this could not be wearable. And I was like, well, this is interesting. I'm just going to watch, like, how do they communicate that this like is not wearable? And they found a wooden frame in the room that we were creating in. So they framed the weaving, and then they went and got a drill, and they hung the weaving on the wall. So it was like very clear communication. Don't you even try to wear this. Which even that is kind of interesting to watch and see how it all came together, and how each group kind of responded to the last group.
Yeah, that's really cool. And for those of you that haven't seen it on social media, we'll post in the show notes so you can kind of look back and kind of see visually what we're talking about here. But Amber, I also wanted to ask you too, just so this doesn't stay, just with the AOE retreat stuff. Is this something that you think people could do in their classroom? Like, what would this sort of exercise, or what would this project look like if you were to do it with a group of students? How could people implement that?
Yeah, I think this would be so much fun to do with students. And so as I was really thinking about this, I probably would do it more as like a beginning of the year activity, or like near the beginning of the year, because it's a really it's one of those things that's fairly easy. So students are going to find success, which we know is important, especially in the beginning of the year. And you can learn so much about your students while you're watching them work, as well as you already are kind of initiating that you want them to think about communication. You could also make up other questions if you wanted to. But you're already getting them set in this idea of reflecting on different things and then working together as a group. So as I mentioned, we had 3 groups of 12, and because there were different sessions going on, like each group came, worked for an hour, and then the next group came. If you wanted to, of course, you could actually kind of model that by having one class after the other, kind of build on the piece and see what happens. But I also know some of you are, that's not possible because of your schedule. You're moving to a different room after one class ends, and someone else is coming to use your room. So if you wanted to do it really just in one class period, part of the way that we did it is when you're doing paper weaving, they don't all have to be working on one weaving at a time. So you don't have to make a warp. You just start to build it, and you can do the basic over-under weaving. And so I have actually done this a lot at home, is you just start lots of mini weavings, leaving some of the ends loose, and then students can work on in groups starting to actually merge all of the weaving together, which that in of itself could be a really interesting lesson for your class, so that they're working kind of independently in smaller groups. But for the project to be finished, then the whole class has to come together and really think about, how do we actually connect this piece? What shape do we want it to make, and how do we work together to make it happen? The other part to really think about, to go back to the idea of, we never really love students to just be standing around. I also, when I set this up, made it people didn't have to start with the writing part. So it was just at some point during our activity time, they needed to write 3 responses. They needed to help with the weaving, and they needed to help with the gluing. And they could use strips that were written on, or they could use just plain strips. And so that way, people always have something to be doing. They can kind of be rotating around, picking different jobs. And I think it's just a really great way as a teacher to be able to move around the room, get to know your students, and just see how they interact with each other.
Yeah, that's awesome. No, and I think that's a really good description, and hopefully that gives people enough to go on if this is something they want to try. So, Amber, we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Thank you so much for giving us some awesome advice professionally and some great ideas for things we can do in the classroom. It's been great. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for hanging out with me.
All right. One part of that discussion that really stood out to me, and don't get me wrong, it was all very, very good. But the one where Amber was talking about the exercise to figure out exactly what your strengths are with communication, where you get together with 2 to 3 people and, when you communicate, think about, what goes well, what makes that type of communication work, and how do we implement those ideas or those practices in a little bit wider way. Or on the contrary, she talked about if things are going poorly, why is that? And what can you change? What can you do to make that better? And I think all of those ideas are worth reflecting on, worth thinking about as you think about the bigger picture of communication, what works for you, how you communicate with your colleagues, your admin, your families, and your students. So put a little bit of thought into that. And now also, somehow we got through that whole interview without us talking about Amber's incredible presentation at the Art Ed Now conference next week. Like all of a sudden, that is next Thursday. So when I'm done here, I'm going to go keep working on some of those final preparations. And when we are done here, you need to go register for the conference if you haven't done that already. You can go to artednow.com to register. Amber's presentation that I just mentioned is all about empowering your kids to make the most of their art class experience. And it's some really, really good advice. I think that'll be worth watching. And, there's also another 20 presentations that are definitely going to be worth your time, including the one and only Ron Clark, the founder of the Ron Clark Academy, and just a plethora of resources and ideas for the school year that's frankly coming up a little sooner than we would like. So we'll see you at the conference on July 25th. Or if you can't make it on that specific day, we will see you whenever you have time to access it throughout the next year, because that is how long you have to get in on all the presentations and all of the resources. It's one day of learning, but you can continue to access everything and continue to learn for the next calendar year. It's very much worth it. Okay, that is all. Thank you to Amber for the discussion and the amazing ideas. And like I said, just great suggestions on how to improve your communication professionally with admins, with families, with colleagues, and also how to foster better communication in your classroom. It was all incredibly valuable. Art Ed Radio is produced by the Art of Education University with audio engineering from Michael Crocker. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back next week as we are getting ready for the Art Ed Now conference, and we'll have a great preview for you. We'll talk to you then.